Welcome to Radio Tipping Point. And our show today is about resolutions 2021. And I picked some big ones. And this is my first live show, I believe, for 2021. And we've had quite a bit going on since we started the year. And I thought it was quite ironic that one of the resolutions that I've included in the list was addressed last Wednesday. And I was debating the whole time, do I go ahead and talk about what happened at the Capitol building on the 6th of January? But I found a way to loop it into the subject matter of today's show. Let's call them a group of individuals. I don't find the necessity of actually giving them a moniker. And there's been a lot of debate of what these individuals were trying to achieve. And I think it has everything to do with my first resolution of 2021, which would be inequality. Now, inequality doesn't have to be real, it can be perceived. And I see a commonality between what took place on the Capitol building last Wednesday, the demonstrations that are taking place here in Austria on the weekend, and apparently there was one that was planned for the 16th, and then because of what happened in DC, they decided to cancel, or at least that was my interpretation. But these individuals feel deprived, all due to this inequality that they believe is taking place, and it's all tied to a position that whites have had in the society. Which actually is a question of privilege. I was listening to a number of podcasts, and we've been running across a number of articles. You can't get past this subject, regardless of whether you're listening to radio, perhaps watching TV, reading blog posts. And the question is always, what do we do? And of course, everybody has their own opinion. But the real question we need to go ahead and pose to ourselves is, how do we bring us all back to reality? And that goes way beyond the question of inequality. Okay, without further ado, let's get started. And as I mentioned, this is the first show of 2021, and there are certain things that I need to go ahead and share with you, some tidbits of information that I've run across just over the last few days that I hope are food for thought. First one is tied to a book that was written in 1972, and I remember reading it a number of years ago, and it was called The Limits to Growth. And it was really one of the first calls to actions that we had tied to this idea that we cannot continue with unlimited economic growth. There are the resources that are required to make this growth happen. We have our population growth, which was a big subject at that time. And they made a prognosis, and that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to go ahead and mention that in the beginning of the show. They claimed that this progress, quote unquote, would continue until the year 2020, which I thought was quite interesting. Obviously, we've been noticing the problems for a number of years. But 2020 truly was the climax, wasn't it? As I mentioned, I have some resolutions I'd like to go ahead and share with you. 3, and they are big, very big. And some of you might go ahead and raise the question, so how come you're picking things that you can never go ahead and accomplish in 2021? And I'm taking a little bit of a different approach in comparison to those typical New Year's resolutions where you try for a while and then you realize it was too big and then you gave up. I'm saying from the beginning, this is way too big, and I cannot do it on my own. So in essence, this is a call to action to all of you. If you can find these resolutions to be worthwhile, if you find them worth pursuing, then let me go ahead and describe them to you, and perhaps you want to try it on your own. And this is truly the spirit of Tipping Point. We all continue on our path, working on something that we believe in, and then all of a sudden something happens and the change has taken place. We don't know what the trigger is, and in essence it's irrelevant. But it was only possible because we were all working in the same direction. So I've already let the cat out of the bag. The first one is inequality. And there's a number of reasons why this is number one. But before I get started with that, let me give you a quote from Robert Goodman, who put together a book also at that time, 1972, called After the Planners. There's a quote from Robert Goodman. Those with more economic means simply have more ability to control their personal and political lives. And this is really what it's about. Power and money. One of the problems I've noticed quite often when talking to individuals tied to circularity, climate change, the problems we have in the abuse that we've performed towards nature. As many of these individuals feel compelled to look at the subject matter solely from an ecological perspective. And then they wonder why we're not able to make the progress that is required for us to reach these goals. And it became very, very clear to me, we forgot the human being. And then once you've gone ahead and planted an idea in your head, then you start finding tidbits of information. And that's really where I've been since I decided that this is where we need to put the focus on the human being. There was a show that I had sometime in summer with Alexandre Lemille, where he also takes up that subject. Doesn't put the human being in the middle, because he believes that the human being is part of an ecosystem, and I agree with that approach. The issue, from my perspective, is that we are not capable of actually understanding that if we're not able to cover the human needs, then how are we collectively able to go ahead and become more in sync with nature, which is really the problem. And of the 3 resolutions that I want to go ahead and share with you today, I believe this is the most difficult one. It's a book that I stumbled across recently, and there was a quote from a U.S. congressman by the name of Rod Dellums. And I actually lived in his district at one time. He was a congressman from Berkeley. Big supporter of ecology. So that almost gave him more of the right to make these comments. So he was together in a meeting that was being held by the Sierra Club, and perhaps some of you might have heard of the Sierra Club. It's an ecological group that has been working for a number of years in the United States to further causes tied to nature. And Dillams came out and more or less said, "So I know that you care about black bears. What about black people?" And I thought that was quite poignant. It's one of the problems that we have. And again, I don't want to emphasize this, putting something better or worse. Just look at this as being an observation. We value the environment more than people. We value certainly animals more than people, not all animals, but certain animals. And then we wonder, how come we can't get past this issue of inequality? But it's all pervasive. When coming to the station, I take the U4. We're in the 20th district, in case you didn't know. I take the U4, and I get on at the U4 in Wien Mitte, coming direction of Heiligenstadt. It's the direction of the station. And there's an interesting collection of placards that are to be found, certainly in the direction that I take. And of course, it's always a question of perspective, from which perspective you're actually looking at things, and perhaps to a certain degree your mindset. But there was one time I was on my way here to the station that I was just waiting for the train, and I noticed there were these collection of placards, as I mentioned, and one was for luxury apartments that were recently built or perhaps are still being built Who knows? And right next to that placard, there was one tied to giving plasma. And they had the amount that you would get for the plasma, the 25 euros, dominated the placard. And I thought that was quite ironic that you would have these two placards next to each other. And I tend to think those individuals that would be interested in the luxury apartments wouldn't necessarily have the need to give plasma, and the value of 25 euros was probably not very high for these individuals. There was a conversation I had with a good friend of mine last week, and he was talking about a condition that I think is perhaps might be one of the roots of this problem of inequality. And I've been talking to him a while, asking him how he's doing, and he was talking about a situation where he really struggled because the individuals he was dealing with did not treat him with dignity. And we were basically talking about that condition. And he was saying that is the worst condition for us as human beings, the lack of dignity. That's something that we all need in some fashion. So in essence, if you wanted to ruin an individual, you take away that dignity. And I started thinking about what he was saying, and he was right. Think about every single case of intimidation. Going through wars. And it could be simple conflict within our society. The first thing we do is start treating people as being subhuman. Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib are some of the most recent examples. And I'm sure you could probably think of enough. So this might be a vehicle that we foster the inequality, and it's also a vehicle by which we ensure it stays that way, because we've built this model in the heads of the populace. And they all believe this to be true. So how do we go ahead and get past this? And this would be the first step that I suggest, and that's certainly part of my approach. And I'm hoping that you might be able to find some added value on that. We have a narrative that we've been passed on through the years that might stay constant, perhaps makes changes. We make some changes in our narrative as we move forward, or we move. I'm not quite sure if it's necessarily forward. And we hear this message so often that we believe it's to be true. And you can test this out pretty easy. and that you're able to go ahead and take a peek at some stationary media going back 50, 60 years, perhaps not even that far back. In fact, I'm sure you can go back to the 70s, maybe even to the 80s. And you look at the narrative that we would have in a certain situation and compare it to that of what we believe today. I could think of a number of them coming from the States. Going back to even the 60s in the United States, in the depiction of blacks, which would be deplorable today, but that was all part of the narrative. And of course, it was all tied to dignity, as it still is today. But if you're able to go ahead and compare the narratives side by side, it becomes very, very apparent. So what I'm trying to do for myself is take some of those narratives that I've been spoon-fed and try to figure out a way of how that narrative would look coming from one of the other stakeholders involved. Can I actually go ahead and empathize with the way that they actually look at it? I'm not saying it's easy. And you could be wrong. But one thing I feel I need to do is make sure that it's not a simple reaction without me actually going ahead and thinking it through. And I ask you to go ahead and try that yourself. See if it actually works. We're performing this action on a number of different levels. Let me give you one example. Again, this was coming out of the States. Perhaps some of you might have heard of the 1619 Project. It's coming from the New York Times. And they were intending to denote the 400-year anniversary when slaves from West Africa were actually brought to North America. And of course, tied to this narrative that we've had in the States since that time, then everything, of course, falls into place. And again, the actions we saw last Wednesday in the Capitol are directly tied to this narrative because people believe that it's true. And if there was a bit of a pushback, bit is actually being very gentle, quite a bit of a pushback from a number of individuals who felt that they were being attacked. And it's all tied to this concept of the narrative. Somebody was telling them directly that the narrative is wrong. And the immediate reaction is, well, if this is wrong, then what about me is right? And people don't like that. And it's understandable. And we see that this trajectory will certainly not change after the 20th of January. Because we're not addressing the truth. So how do we go ahead and address the truth in a more peaceful fashion? That one is truly a question I can't answer. But it was quite interesting looking at the protests last summer, the Black Lives Matter protests, and the reaction we had here in Vienna, where we had 20,000 individuals who got together during a pandemic in Bauhausplatz, and the reaction was to deface the statues that we have in the city. Not all, certain statues. And again, this is all tied to that narrative, right? Within our society here, we have our narratives too. And we start questioning, so why have we believed in this myth? And how do we go ahead and counteract it? So our first reaction is to make sure we don't put these people on pedestals. And lastly, of course, the narrative becomes the justification for our actions. How do we speak openly about these subjects and try at the same time to take the threat away from the individuals? Getting back to the question of the statues, I think is quite interesting. If we look, doesn't matter where you go, certainly not just here in Austria or in the United States, we can go throughout all of Europe, and we look at all these statues that are coming down, or just look at the statues in general, and they're all male. Are we saying that females are a recent invention here? And we have no female heroes? This is the second part of what I've put together in this resolution in my quest. Do we need heroes? I would say we clearly need some sort of role models. And just because they have not been part of our narrative does not mean that they didn't exist. So I've decided for myself to see who are those alternate role models from our past. Explore them and share what you found. And here's the closing part to this resolution. And here I'd like to, again, for those who are interested in joining me on this quest, this is my proposition. Why don't we take a snapshot of where we are today in all its facets, especially concentrating on these resolutions that we'll be completing together. And let's get together in about a year's time. And I'm hoping that we can truly get together in a year's time. And let's compare the progress we were able to make. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the second resolution. And what I did right at the time the show started, I called up a website called 4v4.eu, and it's all tied to biodiversity. And within the site, they go ahead and demonstrate in a very visual way how many football fields of woodlands are actually disappearing. And since the show has started, we have lost 100 football fields. And of course, the football fields are supposed to be demonstrative of the ability for us to actually visualize what kind of dimensions are being destroyed, hoping that it would be a call to action. And apart from the trees that are being lost, and we talk, of course, about the ability for trees to act as a carbon sink, in other words, to take in the CO2 that is being produced from our end, and the lack of trees is one of the big problems. The story seldom recounted is very much tied to all of those living beings that die out because their habitat has been destroyed. And in case you haven't picked it up by now, the subject is biodiversity. And again, there was a reason why I picked this one as number 2. This subject doesn't get as much press as it should, and it's really fatal. Another book I was reading, this was last year. One of the quotes that came out of this book was tied to this idea, the death of birth. Let me go ahead and explain to you what the author meant by this statement. Within nature, we go through a cycle that eventually everything does die, in spite of our best efforts, certainly concerning ourselves. But through that death, we supply the nutrients for a rebirth. What happens when you create a situation where various insects and animals simply become extinct. We can go back to 1858, I believe, with Charles Darwin and the survival of the fittest. But this isn't natural, folks. This is something that we are causing. Once an insect group or a member of the animal population is extinct, they are gone. And I thought a lot about this one last summer. After all, in the pandemic, we had all kinds of time to think, didn't we? And I remember when I was growing up, we had all kinds of birds. And either you had the migration that they were just passing on through, or we would have specific birds in our yards. And I spent a lot of time outside and all of a sudden, one day I realized we have no birds. And some of you might think, well, yeah, you finally coming to that point. It might not always be the quicker one, but that became very apparent to me. And once they're gone, they're gone. Let's see where we're heading on the football fields. We're at 148, 149, and counting. We'll see how far we get with the football fields just for this show. And of course, through this extinction of the insects and the like, the real issue is that we are exterminating biodiversity. Why is that important? If there is one time where we really should open our eyes to the danger, the loss of biodiversity, it has to be during a pandemic. We think that we can control everything, but nature can do a much better job than we can. Certainly there have been enough insects and the like that have been exterminated through the use of certain pesticides. Or agricultural monoculture. And we cannot see the use of these vermins, so we get rid of them. And of course, if we look at the root cause of our pandemic and we believe that we can control it, we are solely wrong. That means we're clearly not prepared for the next one. So we keep eliminating the place for wild animals to live. I ask you a question, where are they supposed to go? 159, 160, 161, 162. Where are these animals supposed to go? And we've spread ourselves out, right? Because we're saying this area is ours. So if they have no other place to go, they're living with us. And it's almost guaranteed that the next pandemic will be on its way. So I mentioned this is part of my resolution. So what am I going to do about it? This one is a bit difficult. I cannot go ahead and create wilderness, and I certainly can't bring back insects from extinction. But what I can do, what we all can do, is stop this path that we're taking right now. So the two actions I'm going to take might seem minor. And you might even struggle in seeing the connection with the biodiversity. But I can close that loop, I promise you. The first one is tied to this idea, what we do with the food that we don't need anymore. Now, we've had some great ideas here in Vienna. And the idea on paper of the biotone is a good one. But we've noticed that it's become a challenge. We have not properly explained the concept to members of our society. So that means they might not necessarily understand. We leave a lot to the responsibility of those individuals. And if they don't follow the rules, quote unquote, that becomes a problem. And what I've seen is that because there have not been enough trash receptacles, that was the only quote-unquote viable solution that some individuals can find. And I don't discount the possibility that there are people out there who simply don't care. So how do we actually go ahead and approach it? What I plan to do is set up composting in my apartment block. That means I take the initiative to talk to the owners, whether they would accept it. I need to talk to my neighbors to explain to them why it's important, why I'm doing it, and asking them to participate, not demanding, but asking them. If they want to participate, then they can participate. If they don't, who am I to go ahead and put a stigma on somebody? But I personally believe that through positive examples, you can win people over. If you give them a solution that is easy and it makes them feel good, then you're already on the path of success. So can we imagine that we were all able to properly compost? Then maybe we'll start thinking about, how much we're actually throwing away. Secondly, we're ensuring that what we compost is being brought back into nature. And we're doing something together. Meaning that we're reducing the waste. And I see this as being a small contribution towards biodiversity. And then there's another project tied to vertical farming, but I think I'll go in more into detail on a later installment. Now I'm on to my third resolution. And this is, in my opinion, the easiest one, certainly for me. And it would be nice if it was easy for others, because then some of our biggest problems would be eliminated. And it's all tied to the elimination of waste. And I don't go out and say that we're CO2 reduction and the like, because we need to be able to drill down the actions to those things that we can do on our own, and not some sort of abstract concept. And of course, this kind of brings everything together, and all tied to this model that we currently have, where we take things from nature without giving back. We produce things that nobody needs, and at the end we throw things away and believe that the problems are solved. But one of the issues, of course, is that once we've put those pieces of trash into whatever receptacle we might be using, probably in a plastic bag, and we take it down to the dumpster, we've crossed it off our list and entertain no more thoughts about what actually happens to that material. And this is part of our problem, because we're just pushing it off and we say it's not our problem. But in essence, the problem starts in actually buying things that we eventually have to get rid of. And of course, I'm not saying that this can all be wished away with a magic wand. And I think we need to take baby steps to actually go ahead and make progress. But the first thing we can all start doing is thinking about, so that trash that we put in the receptacle, what actually happens to it? And then we start to postulate what actually transpires with that material and what possible damage does it cause. And then we start realizing we have more power than we realize. And this is what I've decided is my approach. And I ask you, for those that might be a bit enticed by some of these things I'm saying, please feel free to go ahead and try it yourself. We keep thinking that because we do things a certain way today, that it was always done that way. And we have a very short-term memory. But what if we were able to go ahead and put ourselves in some sort of cognitive time machine where we're able to go back to, say, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, the way that things were done. The question of scarcity, the examples of ingenuity, and learn from them how we could do things different. Doing things different doesn't always have to be something new. It could also be something that we knew, but we simply forgot. So I plan to make a very concerted effort to see if those things that I'm doing, how many of them are just part of a process that I don't really think about, and maybe it's about time that I do think about them, and I might not be able to solve it right away. My experience is that I become frustrated. I don't know how to approach it. But I really start thinking about it. And getting back to that idea that I mentioned earlier, for those of you who want to join me in this quest, one of the exercises I'm truly going to do is making a mental note of this condition on the 12th of January, 2021. And what kind of progress I was able to make with these three desires, my resolutions, that I know that I could never accomplish on my own. And I believe that we are able to put much more into motion than we realize. And how many times have I run across a situation where I felt I didn't get anything done today, and then I go back and I take mental steps back, thinking about how the whole day went. And I realize there was a whole collection of baby steps out there. So let's see how our tally's coming along. 202 football fields in less than an hour. So in conclusion, how are these three resolutions tied to each other? Some elements are very apparent, some less so. I would say the first step is directly tied to the notion that no waste means no people are considered waste. If there's one thing we clearly need to break, and that's getting back to the concept that I mentioned at the beginning of this program, tied to the idea, the desire, and the requirement of dignity, that we have to stop thinking that people are just things that we throw away. And I would argue, tied to this concept of dignity, that nature should also be treated with the same dignity. So we're able to go ahead and show that towards our fellow human beings. And to the environment where we are. These are steps that we can all take, right? I think you would agree with me, we could all take them. And that would be my New Year's challenge to you.